Dr. Barbara Gilbert. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'm here to present about a true power paradigm and a way to help people with climate anxiety and distress. That was showing up in my practice a lot, and we wanted to provide a more community-based process for people to address that. So I'm going to be giving an introductory session about that and the true power paradigm in particular. And I also have Daryl with me. Daryl, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Daryl Peterson, and I am a member of the Resilient Activist, and am interested in helping the environment and also learning healthy coping skills to be able to do that effectively. And I've found true power paradigm to be a great approach. I'm here to help.
Yes, and thank you for that. I wanted Daryl here because I didn't want to just be a talking head. It's nicer to talk to somebody about these concepts. So again, what we're talking about is the true power paradigm, and it's very connected to a process that helps people when they feel helpless or hopeless or in despair or depressed in some way. And because so many people are struggling with the climate crisis in these ways, this paradigm applies to this part of life as well. So I'm going to open up a PowerPoint here and share that to the screen, and we'll do a slideshow for you, and hopefully you can see me and this. Let's start from the beginning. Okay, so you know who I am. Let's take a look at this mountain lion. Part of why we're starting here is because our sense of understanding what power is has to start with our understanding of our bodies and our neurophysiology and how that relates to concepts of power. So we're going to start here. Take a look at that mountain lion and notice anything you can about her. Notice her stance, her eyes, her ears, everything. And then notice what's happening in your body as you look at her. And imagine that you come across her on a hike somewhere and she's only about 20 feet away from you, looking at you like that. And notice what happens in your body and in your mind. And what happens is what we call the threat response. And it's pretty hardwired. It's built into a really primitive part of our nervous system. It's mostly happening outside of conscious control. And what happens in the hardwired threat response is that our muscles get contracted, our heart and breathing change in the cardiovascular system. So our heartbeat gets faster and harder. Our breathing comes up into our chest and becomes more shallow, but also faster. Our digestive system is, the blood flows away from the digestive system. So we might feel a sinking feeling in our stomach or similar things. Our vision changes too. When we're in this really primitive threat response, we become hyper-focused on the thing we think is threatening, and everything else around us starts to blur out. We're not noticing those as much. And the same thing happens in our thinking processes. We start to narrow our thinking only to the, oh no, what's going on here, rather than that broader thinking. So for example, if we come across this mountain lion, we're thinking, oh, she looks like she's really stalking me. Is she ready to attack, rather than, oh, look how beautiful that mountain lion is. If you're not a threat from this mountain lion, you're probably thinking how beautiful she is and you're glad mountain lions are not extinct and all those things. But when you're in the threat itself, you're mostly going to be focused on which moves she's making or the look in her eye, those kinds of things. So our thinking narrows down too. The focus of our consciousness changes as well. We're focused very much on this immediate interaction. We're not thinking about other things that we've learned or understood or care about even. We're just we can get just only in that moment. And in the threat response, it's almost like a computer program that gets booted up. When that gets triggered, the only possible responses, if we're fully in it, are fighting, running, freezing, or shutting down. That's it. And we humans are way more complex creatures than that. That may be as good as it gets for some of the lower creatures, but it's definitely not as good as it gets for humans. So in some ways, having this threat response in us can disempower us. And that's why we're talking about it. Just to give you a visual of this. So you might think of it as a constriction that's going on. We might be feeling and thinking about all kinds of things, but as soon as we perceive a threat, we constrict. We might experience that as tension. We might even feel it as anger, and in some cases, we'll feel it as a full-blown rage. And there's a lot more complexity to this. Some people have been conditioned to skip right to the response without having those feeling experiences in between, but other people do feel those. But at any rate, the only places to end up are the defensive responses, which are fight, run, or freeze. You might have heard this as flight, flight, or fright. That's always hard to say, so I changed it to fight, run, or freeze. But then alternatively, if none of those defensive responses are likely to work in our split-second assessment, we might go into numbing and shutdown. And that's different than freeze. In the numbing and shutdown response, we don't feel much of anything. We're just not present to the moment. In freeze, it's this very tense, very high energy response, but we're frozen. Whereas in the shutdown, we're kind of, just not there emotionally or physically. And some people would say, I'm trying to decide, I'm going to let these show up here so you can read them. But this part of what I would usually present about the threat response is less important for what we're talking about today, but it's important if you want to understand it in general. And the important part for what we're talking about today, I would say, is the very bottom line. Try to get familiar with your own defensive response style, because we lead with something different usually. Like I lead with a fight response because my tension starts all up in my shoulders and arms and jaw, like this, mode. And other people, it's in their legs. So they might have a run response as their initial leading response. And other people go very quickly into this numbed, passive kind of place, which means that their shutdown response comes very quickly. The shutdown response normally shouldn't come until after defensive responses have been tried. But for some people, as it says here on the slide, if you've been punished for fighting back or trained in a dominance parenting model, you might go straight to shutdown and just try to endure and get through it. So this is, it is important to know our typical style so we can be alert to it and do some of the things I'm going to teach you to do about, getting back out of this threat response, because it really isn't going to be useful for us. The shutdown process, we consider that kind of a mercy response, a preparation to lose. We think this probably developed evolutionarily speaking because people who or creatures, because we share this with all the animals down to the reptiles, creatures who were attacked but not actually killed might survive better if they're in a shutdown response than if they were constantly fighting. Like at some point, there's some calculus that goes on that allows animals and us to kind of give up when we can survive better by doing that. So we call it the mercy response, because who wants to be on high alert if you're about to be devoured alive, for one thing? It can happen, the shutdown can happen really fast for some people, and in some situations, it can be at different levels. We can still be tracking, but not really present. Some common examples of that shutdown process: if you're driving a really familiar route, you can get all the way there and not know how you got there or not recall the experience. It's because it's a boring route and we get kind of, it's unpleasant. And so we go into what we call in a clinical situation, a dissociated place, so that we can get through it more pleasantly. We got better things to do in our minds. And because we can still operate the vehicle safely, then it works okay. So we use this all the time, but it actually is a fairly disempowered place, as you might imagine. Like if you're fully disconnected, or, if you're fully in a shutdown response, you're not available to respond effectively to anything. So, and we humans are very prone to being conditioned to go quickly to shut down or the defensive responses. That part of our nervous system can be trained in a way almost, well, I would say definitely too easily. And because we're not, culturally aware of this fact, we're not teaching kids to notice that, to notice when they're going into anger, and not teaching them very well about how to pull back from that, not noticing when they're going into a shut down, numbed place and how to pull back out of that. In fact, we have a lot of cultural practices that teach us shut down. When I get done with work and I just want to check out, I might disappear into some rabbit hole and exploring something in my computer, or I might watch TV that's kind of mindless. Those are all shutdown responses. They're okay in small measure, but they're mostly disempowering. So if we're actually feeling, depressed or anxious or hopeless or helpless, these kinds of processes, all of them in the threat response, are not going to help us. They're going to make things worse. Is all of this making sense so far, Daryl? Okay enough?
Yes, it is. And it's good information.
Okay, I'll keep going.
Yeah.
So the other thing to know about the hardwired threat response is that when it gets triggered at all, we start to see everything in terms of threat. And again, the only responses are fight, run, freeze, or shut down. There's another one called placate that comes from a slightly higher part of our nervous system. I probably won't go too much into that. But because these are ineffective, even with a mountain lion, if you run, what does a mountain lion do? It's going to chase. All cats love to chase. If you try to fight it, you're pretty likely to lose because it has those sharp claws and, the teeth, and it's got muscle and mass behind it. You're going to lose a fight. And if you freeze, it's going to break the stalemate. And if you shut down, you're just not responding at all. So the responses that come out of this threat response are almost never the best thing that a human being can come up with in any situation, whether it's a mountain lion or the climate crisis. And we'll talk about how to apply these ideas to that. Do you know what the best thing to do with a big cat is? It's at least what they told me in my when I was 12 and the park ranger was describing this. You're supposed to get big and back away and give it a way out. You're not supposed to approach it, but you're not supposed to just stare at it, and you're not supposed to run. What about, have you learned any other methods with a big cat, Daryl?
No, that is what I would have, that I've read about and heard about. I have not been presented with that challenge, and I hope that's what I would remember to do when it happened.
Yes, and we won't remember if we get too triggered into that threat response. So
right.
We need to really figure out how to pull back out of that threat response. And one of the most amazing, simple techniques to pull out of that threat response is, as soon as we feel that constriction, we can start to do deep sighing breaths. And that actually changes our nervous system. And we want that diaphragm muscle, that's where the rib cages meet, and that breathing muscle, to stretch. When it stretches, we switch from the sympathetic nervous system, which runs the threat response, to the parasympathetic, which is a more relaxed but alert state of mind. And in that state of mind, we can think, we can remember all the things we've learned. We can, we undo that tunnel vision and the tunnel thinking that goes with the threat response. So if that mountain lion happened to just walk away and decide you were no big deal, as soon as it was safely out of range, you'd go, whoa, that was close, or that was wild. You'd have some big, deep sighing breath, and you discharge it, and your body gets reset, your mind gets reset. And then, of course, you'd have to probably go tell everybody about it, because that's what we humans do to process interesting and difficult experiences. But that big, deep sighing breath is what we're after. And so we all know from meditation practice, if you've had that, or even if you do singing or certain There's lots of ways we've learned about belly breathing. We've learned the importance of breathing with the diaphragm. So we just want to bring that back in. And we were born knowing how to do that. It's the natural reset when the threat is over, but we can do it on purpose because we know we don't need that threat response. So anytime we feel constriction, big, deep sighing breath, reorient our thinking away from, oh no, to, well, I don't like this. What do I need to do about it? And so we can see how important this is with climate crisis stuff, because there's so much to worry about and so many things that pull our attention in that oh no kind of way. But the oh no thinking isn't going to get us anywhere. If it did, I'd say go for it, but it absolutely disempowers us. So rather than saying, oh no, about the next and the last and all the many things we've heard about what's going wrong in the climate, it's much more useful to take those big, deep breaths and say, okay, this is really hard to look at. This has some implications that are really difficult for me, or that I just don't like, or that I'm feeling really upset about. But to say, oh no, and treat it as a threat, even though at some level it's not the kind of threat that our threat response is good for. We need our highest level thinking and processing and problem solving and people skills, and we need all that stuff on board. And the only way we can get there is if we keep that threat response down, keep it managed. And we do that with belly breathing and reorienting our thinking. So I think it's important to remember that when we're feeling hopeless or helpless or overwhelmed, it's usually because we're stuck in that threat response program. So we need to take those breaths and reorient our thinking. So from the threat response, so that's just what's going on in our own bodies, and we're just one person, but there's this larger social thing that happens because all the people have the threat response in them. There's a way that the threat response becomes played out at this social level, and I'm going to walk you through it, but that's what we call the dominance power paradigm. So the threat response gives us a false idea about what power really is. When we're in the threat response, it feels like we're going to be powerful. Especially the fight response feels powerful, but also if we effectively run away from that mountain lion, we feel powerful. Or if we freeze and can hide from it enough, we feel like we've handled things. But especially that fight response feels like power. But all that it really is, because as we pointed out, even with the mountain lion, you didn't actually, if you come at it with a fight response, you're going to probably get hurt and maybe killed. So it isn't actually powerful for what you actually wanted to happen. You wanted to survive and go about your day peacefully and hopefully let the mountain lion do the same. And we won't accomplish that with those threat responses, but it's going to feel good. It feels good. It's gratifying. So this primitive program in us reinforces us, it gives us gratification when we act out any of those responses. That's why fighting feels good. It's why yelling at people feels good, but none of it is actually powerful in the ways that, if I ask people, I used to work with convicted violence offenders, and I would ask them, what did you hope to get from your violence, for example? And invariably it was something that you never could get through violence. It would be like, well, I want her to know that she has to respect me as the man in the family. Okay, do you think she'll respect you more if you're violent or if you're kind and loving? So it doesn't get us where we want to be. And similarly with the climate crisis, if I go out, yelling at everybody that I think is doing everything wrong. If I go to a family member and say, why the heck aren't you recycling? You're damaging the earth and you're so bad for this. Are they going to listen to me more and give credibility to me more or less? It's going to be less. So we have to figure out what to do with ourselves and how to serve what matters most to us in a more effective way. But it's going to feel good in the moment. So we have to just know that and just say, that's not it's not feeling good that I want. It's actual effectiveness and true power. So this is where we get the name of the true power paradigm. So as you might have already gathered, in order to know true power, we have to understand what matters to us the most. If we only go with the primitive threat response, if we just get pulled along by our own biology, we're going to take the wrong path. Okay, I was wanting to get to this dominance power paradigm. So when we have the false idea about what power is, and then we start to act in community with other people, and we want to be powerful in community, we're going to try to act out power in these ways that use threat, pain, fear as a way to try to manage other people or even control other people. So we think in this dominance paradigm, we think we get what we want when we can make you do what I might want. So it's always focused on the other as the source of the problem or the thing that we need to, manage. Just like in the threat response with the mountain lion, we think we have to manage that mountain lion to be safe. No, we have to manage ourselves. And same with any community-wide interaction. So if the problem is always the other and all our energy goes towards trying to get the other person or the other group to be different, and that's not actually powerful or effective, but it feels good, again, we have to just have enough consciousness to know that when I get on Facebook and, yell at somebody or tell them how stupid they are or how wrong they are, that's only gratifying. It's not actually powerful or effective. So there's more to the dominance power paradigm than that, but I think it's important to know that it starts from that false idea about what power really is. And we all fall into it. It's built into our nervous system. We're gratified by it. Every now and then I'm driving down the road and somebody cuts me off and I get, tense and like, I might say, you idiot, and I'm mad because they put me in danger. But does that anger and tension help me keep myself safer? No, I have to get control of myself enough to drive well, even if other people are driving badly. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about this. So the dominance paradigm is when that threat response is combined with privilege hierarchies. And privilege hierarchies, I'll get into a little bit more, but those two together, the dominance paradigm results in dehumanization of ourselves and others. It results in other focus and poor self-awareness, and it results in tactics of blaming and shaming, and we end up in power struggles. So I need to talk about privilege hierarchies. Actually, first, let's do this comparison. So we want to change the paradigm. The dominance paradigm and the threat response are these problems that we have to solve. They're going to occur. It's part of human nature. It's the lower part of human nature, but we also have a higher part of human nature that we can draw on. So the dominance paradigm ends up in dehumanizing, other focus, blaming, shaming, that kind of thing. In the true power paradigm, we're going to do the antithesis of that. In the true power paradigm, we're going to practice personal respect. We're going to practice being self-focused and personally accountable. And we're going to also focus on practices that build our responsibility, our personal ability to respond. So that's the contrast. We're kind of having to think what's happening in the dominance paradigm, and let's do the opposite. So in the true power paradigm, respect means we have three core components to the true power paradigm. The first one is respect, which addresses dehumanization. In the respect component, it means the ability to value self and others in all circumstances. That's tough sometimes, to value somebody who you think is doing damage to the environment, who is being mean to you, who's clueless about themselves in the world, but that's going to be important. And I'll want to dig into that and show you how respecting others, definitely respecting yourself increases your power, but respecting others increases your empowerment too. In the true power paradigm, a second main component is accountability, and that in this paradigm just means the ability to account for your own experiences and choices. So it's about self-awareness, right? And in this model, responsibility is the ability to respond effectively according to your own longings and intentions. So you're not trying to please anybody else. You're not being commanded by anybody else. It's knowing your own longings and intentions, and then you're going to work to serve those. There's some kind of sub-skills or practices in each of these components. In the respect component, again, this is the ability to value self and others in all circumstances. How do we do that? The very top level skill is simply giving attention. The roots, the Latin roots of the word respect, re-inspect. Spect means to look. Re is again. To look again. It's basic attention, and maybe a more thorough kind of attention than we might do on the fly in our normal life. The second one is to give human value, and here I would say give all life value. You know, that we're going to do better in addressing the climate crisis if we remember the value of all life. A third level, you know, an increasing level of respect is to give protection and safety to ourselves, to other people, to other creatures, to other life on the planet. And then the highest level of respect is to give resources for the well-being of self, to others, the well-being of the planet. So we're going to learn how to practice respect in some future sessions specifically related to climate issues. And the true power paradigm, accountability, is simply the ability to account for your experiences and choices. In the dominance paradigm, if we use a word like accountability, we often think of blame and shame, like, oh, I'm going to hold you accountable means, you know, you're in trouble and some kind of punishment is coming. That's not what we mean in this model at all. It's really just the ability to account for yourself. We can also hold other people accountable in this model by asking them to explain or help us understand their experiences and choices, and hold them to shared agreements, you know, so holding people accountable in that way, holding ourselves accountable that way. There are 3 levels of skills in this as well. If you remember in the threat response, the focus is all on the other. It's on the mountain lion, or it's on the person doing bad recycling or whatever. And in this model, we want to pull the focus back to ourselves, because we're really the only person, the only thing we can do anything about. And that's not a small thing, but it's important to remember that that's where our empowerment is, on the self. So this isn't a self-focus that's narcissistic. It's not saying I'm only focusing on me because I'm the only important thing here. It's saying I'm focusing on me so I can come to understand what matters to me. I can come to see how well I am or am not fulfilling, you know, my intentions. You know, it's that kind of self-focus. And then there's a level of self-awareness, like when you focus in, what do you see? And in some of the sessions, we'll be digging really into what does self-awareness look like, identifying your longings. There's a process we have for doing that, and then how to begin to build actions based on those longings. And then self-expression is the third part of accountability. You frequently are going to want to share what you understand about yourself with other people, what you understand about what matters to you and why. And then you're going to also want to be able to listen to other people in that way as well. So we have respect, we have accountability, and we have responsibility. These are the 3 core practices, core components of the true power paradigm. In the true power paradigm, responsibility is the ability to respond effectively according to your own longings and intentions. As we talked about in the accountability piece, there's a process to come to understand and be aware of their own longings. And then we want to be able to build a skill set that allows us to serve those as effectively as possible. There are all kinds of responses, as you might think of them, skills that could use refinement in any one of us. Like I always joke, I'll be learning true power for the rest of my life, because there is no end. It's ever, there's an ever deeper level you can go to in your refinement of your skills and your understanding and your empowerment. But in our culture, there are certain skills that we would put in the responsibility component that are not well taught. One of them is self-management, particularly of that threat response. You know, people, we somehow, especially I would say in the Trump era, there was all kinds of normalization of acting out our emotions. You know, we weren't being shown examples or being encouraged or expected to manage ourselves. It was like, whatever you feel in this moment is fine to say. And we really need to pull that back in and gain more of those skills. I wish we were teaching them to kindergartners and preschoolers, because they're perfectly capable of learning those, but most of us have not been taught much about how to do that. Another skill that we in this culture aren't real strong with as a whole is what I call awareness listening. So in the accountability component, we talked about the ability to express ourselves, but we also want that to be an interpersonal skill, to be able to listen to others with that kind of depth, and to be able to invite more from people if we don't understand, rather than have a power struggle. We also don't know how to set boundaries very well. We know how to lash out at people, but that's not boundary setting. And what does it mean to say, here's what I'm willing to do, and that's the line of it, or the way that I'm being treated right now is not okay, or this part of our land is not being treated okay, and that's not okay with me. And holding people accountable for policies, those kinds of boundary setting. We don't know much about that at the personal level. We don't know much yet about it at policy and political activism levels. And so we have more refinement we could do. And definitely conflict resolution. We just don't have those skills very well established in our culture. So if any given person is asking, what skills do I need to work on for empowerment? These are good places to start for sure. And some of our presentations will help people with that, specifically as it relates to addressing climate crisis issues. We mentioned already also that the self-management of the threat response is an important one, hugely important. Like everybody has to know how to do this, or we can't get very far. It has to be able to do it well enough. None of us is perfect. So the first step of being able to manage the threat response is being aware of your own constriction cues. I was saying earlier, you kind of get to know your defense pattern. If you're a fighter, a runner, a freezer, or somebody who shuts down, do that belly breathing. And grounding is another term I bring into this that is very useful if you tend to go into shutdown, which is just noticing your 5 senses. So again, with a lot of meditation practice, you'll have grounding as a reorientation when you're done with the meditation. Just noticing your 5 senses. What are you hearing? What are you smelling? What are you hearing? What are you tasting? What's your sense of touch bringing in to awareness? And then another major part of a threat response when we're dealing with people is being able to communicate, either to take a time out for yourself when you're overwhelmed by your threat response, being able to set a boundary with someone else. I can't talk right now. I need a break. I'll come back to this. Or communicating to find a mutual understanding. And I know I'm just touching on these things, and there's way more to say about all of them, but I'll move on. So in true power activism, just to begin to start to visualize how this true power paradigm works, if people want to be an activist around climate change or the climate crisis, it's going to be most effective when it has a connection to the humanity or value of ourselves and others, and trying to understand other people's perspectives, especially other people's longings. At that level, when we're connected with each other and understanding each other better, we almost are, it's much less likely that we're going to have conflict, because we all kind of want the same things. We want to, everybody wants to have a healthy place to live, wants to be healthy themselves, wants their grandchildren, or the next generations to have a decent place to live. They're at the most basic levels, our longings are the same. We have a lot of disagreements about how to get there, whether there's any risk to that, all that. But at the most basic longings, we can usually find common ground. And so good activism is finding common ground and not yanking people, towards a particular goal in a dominance paradigm kind of way, but inviting people and building that common ground, building a shared vision that takes into account what matters most to as many people as possible. It also is most effective when we're speaking up, when we're using voice rather than acting out, as the threat response might have us do. When we're speaking up to express our own perspective, when we're willing to tell those painful truths without shaming, but also without hiding. And when we're persistently calling for accountability from policymakers or other authorities. And in a democracy, those policymakers and authority, they work for us. And so we get to hold them accountable as we understand our role in this system. They may understand it differently, but we get to hold ourselves in it the way we want to. It's also effective when it's based on advocacy for our own deepest longings and highest intentions, and when our actions are focused on what's most important to us and is in our realm of influence. So again, it's less about trying to get other people to be different and more about just coming organically to express what matters most to us. So, if a family member isn't recycling, instead of saying, you're being bad, you're hurting, or you're doing, all those you statements, I would bring it back and have I statements like, I saw you throw that can in the trash, and here's what goes through my mind. I think about all the landfills, and it seems like one thing that is pretty easy for us to do. It's set up already. We have recycling bins. Can I ask you to try that for a week? Would that be okay? Because I feel uncomfortable when I watch people throw it away. And if you don't want to try it, will you let me take it? I can come and get it for you and put it where it needs to be if you'll just separate it for me. Those kinds of, I'm talking about me and what matters to me and inviting somebody into that. They may say no, and that will be, then I'll have to figure out, okay, what's my longing in that situation? Let me stop and see if there's any comments or questions, Daryl, at this point.
It's great information. I'm agreeing. I'm shaking my head a lot, and it's good how you're are putting this all together. One of the things that comes up is just that the challenge of when I see somebody throwing a can away that could be recycled, and then staying conscious enough to respond from a place that is not out of judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And because I think as soon as judgment gets in there, then how I speak it can automatically make somebody defensive. So if it's from that blaming, as you were talking about, so that being accountable for myself and being present, that's the challenge, one of the many challenges for me that I long to be able to do.
Mm-hmm.
And because I think this would make a huge difference. It's wonderful information.
Yeah, and that piece about respect, like all of these are practices. We don't get to stop practice. Like I'm never going to be the master at any of these, because that threat response is always coming in there trying to turn us down that rutted road. And so the more we practice respect, the harder it is to come at somebody with a shaming kind of judgment. But we're never going to be perfect at it. And so when we notice that, we can be like, oh, okay. And often with people, we can repair that too. We can go back and say, afterwards, I wasn't happy how I talked to you about that. And this is what I honestly believe. I really don't think you're a bad person. It just, for me, it brings a lot of feelings up when I see recycling not happening or whatever the issue might be. And so, I'm trying not to be this uncomfortable all the time. And I'm wondering if there's some shared ground we can get to where you're okay with what you're doing and I'm okay with, how the recycling is happening, and how do we get there where we can both be plenty okay with it. And hopefully people who care about us care that they're creating distress, or, if we can express why it matters so much to us, maybe they'll start to understand more of it and care too in a different way. But yeah, the respect is the key to all of that, and it needs practice. And our mass media doesn't teach us much about respect, so it has to be a personal practice for sure.
Right. Yeah. there aren't a lot of examples of how to do it in the everyday world. Yeah.
All right, thanks. And jump in with other comments if you have them. So I want to talk a little bit more about privilege. I said that privilege hierarchies plus the threat response create the dominance paradigm. And this is going to matter a lot in our larger response to the climate crisis, and paying attention to who's getting impacted the most and where the resources go to try to fix or manage some of what's happening. So I wanted to dig into this a little bit. So, just like with the mountain lion, I have an imagination exercise for you. Imagine if you were living in a village, in times past when villages were the way we lived, and that you had extra food or more than you and your immediate family needed. Who would you give the extra to? Are you going to give it to your best friend who lives over in that other village because she's struggling? Or are you going to give it to the neighbor who you don't know as well, but lives right next door, who's also struggling? Are you going to give it to people in your own and nearby villages who look and dress and speak like you, or needier strangers a few more villages over who you heard are starving? So what we're getting at here, we can all kind of feel that. Like, I know my answers would be, I'd probably give it to my best friend instead of my neighbor, because I have a much more deep connection and a commitment to nurture that person. I also, I'm going to feel like my circle of care embraces people who are like me. That may even be hard or soft wired into us to think that way, to take care of our own, quote unquote. But there's a problem with that when we're no longer in a village, which is that whoever has resources starts to dole them out according to privilege. And so privilege is when access to resources is assigned not according to merit or other need, but according to whom we've decided to care about or align with, and when there's no accountability for how those resources are used. So you can picture how, if you've got some people who are at the top of the, have all the resources and are doling them out, and you throw dominance into that, or the threat response into that. If I've got this stockpile and I want to be in charge of who gets the extra, how am I going to protect it? I'm going to use, fear. I'm going to use violence or threat. I'm going to try to protect it by making other people scared. I may even try to use it to get advantage. Like, oh, I don't like you living here. If you'll move further out so my friend can live here, I'll let you have some resources. So I start to use it to manipulate and control things. That's privilege too. So there are going to be some people, just because of their relationship to me or my sense of their relationship to me, that are going to get more than others. And so that privilege hierarchy, especially when it's enforced with dominance strategies, has created this problem we now have across the world about climate issues. So already the people who were overprivileged used up a bunch of resources. They're an unfair share, and I would say, the United States is a huge example of that, at the expense of people who were underprivileged. It wasn't shared equally. And then in the process of taking those resources and using them, some environmental damage was done that is also impacting people who live in more environmentally damaged areas, and fewer resources to help support them as they need to be for their livelihood to continue are given. So we get privilege and dominance dynamics going on at all levels. Like, who's taking, from the earth in the first place in a way, and in a careless way that hurts the environment and hurts the communities that rely on those environments. And then how do we figure out how to manage the climate crisis in a more equitable way? So issues of equity and justice always have to do with privilege. And we want to try to think about how that plays in the dominance paradigm, how we participate in it unconsciously, and how to stop participating unconsciously with it. So that's all that's a whole area of the true power paradigm to address as well. To try to put it concisely, privilege in the dominance paradigm usually means that the overprivileged have been able to impact the environment without accountability, that the overprivileged will get more of the resources to manage the climate crisis, and that the underprivileged will be prioritized lower, and the impact on them will be acknowledged less and attended to less. So this is, this is the given, just like the threat response is the given, unless we operate differently. And we do have that option to operate differently. Some of the ways that we can do that, if we're overprivileged, we can recognize that the dominance paradigm has a central lie, which is that the overprivileged are actually really dependent on the underprivileged. They're dependent on their labor, they're dependent on the resources of the land they occupy, they're dependent on this movement of economic and financial resources upward, and the systems are set up for that, but they're dependent on the underprivileged. And so we can think about the power of unions to imagine how we can take that in a different direction. If we're overprivileged, we can also divest privilege by holding ourselves and other overprivileged accountable, like through laws. We can listen to the underprivileged, take time, give that respect of attention and listening to them. We can add our own voices to advocate, through political activism. If we're underprivileged, we can hold the overprivileged accountable. As some people say, the light is a great disinfectant. If we are naming what's going on and it doesn't match with community values or laws or, how we've all agreed on how things should be done, then that shows. And those people they're not going to be as powerful when they're shown up in that way. Again, we don't want to do it in a shaming way, just accountability. You said you were about this. This is what you're doing. Those don't match. That's not okay. We're holding you accountable to match what you said. We can also band together, like we said about the unions. We can create a power of numbers that we might not have as individuals. And we can call on what I call better angels in the privilege, the better angels of our nature, to use their privilege for us. And we can sometimes do that by reminding people who are in an overprivileged position that their own best interest is at stake as well. We'll get into more of that in other sessions, but that's just a basic introduction. And that's the end of the slideshow. Let me stop sharing and see what other questions or thoughts you have. I'm sorry, I'm getting all these notifications during this. Go ahead. Do you have any comments or questions? You're muted.
I'm muted. I appreciate the that description of privilege. That's useful to me, and greater understanding of the parts involved. I was thinking of our country, the Native Americans, and how long it has taken, and I suppose will continue to take, for the general public, for people who seem caring, but aren't doing much, or aren't, it doesn't really register deeply to them, say someone like me, that how unfair the underprivileged in our culture, in Native Americans, indigenous people, have been treated. And my brain is saying, well, some of these things take time, but that dominance power is it's strong. It can. I don't know. I guess there's a part of us that is attracted to that. I guess it's an easy kind of behavior to fall into.
Right.
It feels good, but it certainly isn't healthy, and it isn't what the earth needs. So.
Yeah. It sounds like you get that, and you can see all the different ways that we can work on trying to be conscious of where privilege is and how dominance plays out with privilege, and that will give us more avenues to address this effectively.
Right. Well, and I think it's a process. I think, speaking of my own experience, of really working down through my levels of consciousness into what is there and how do I evolve and free myself from the dominance behavior that is and it's an unconscious behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So
we'll work
that
on
was good.
that session. So keep coming to Climate of Community, and I hope people who watch this do, because again, I can give an introduction, but those kinds of questions are going to take a lot of exploration and practice and new skills training, all that stuff to help us. And again, it starts to feel urgent that we need to learn these things in order to deal with the climate crisis. So I appreciate your investment in it. I can hear how much you want that, and that kind of longing takes us a long way. So I think this is a good place to stop if you're okay with that. And
yes, it's great. Thank you very much.